Welcome to the Profile Series. My name's Terry Duenas, and you're in for a special treat today. It is, we're recording this on January 15th, the actual birthday of Dr. Martin Luther King, and we're going to have a discussion with one of our esteemed citizens, Walter Barboza from the town of Barnstable. Again, a civil rights activist, a human rights activist, a producer here at the Community Media Center, and a lecturer, a consultant. Walter is a terrific individual that we can learn a lot from. Walter, welcome. It's great to have you here. He's also a golfer. May not be that good a golfer, but he's a golfer. And it's so good to have you here, and we appreciate you talking to us a little bit about Dr. King and his legacy, and why on his birthday it's important to remember his birthday.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to thank you first for inviting me here and giving me this opportunity.
My pleasure.
As you can notice in the background, picture of Dr. King and of Coretta Scott King. What has been missing from over the last years since the passing of Mrs. King is that on the national holiday, when they talk about Dr. King, you very seldom hear a reference to Mrs. King. But looking at the history of that movement and after the assassination of Dr. King, we have the national holiday strictly because of the efforts of Mrs. Coretta Scott King.
Wonderful.
And her legacy is just as great as her husband's, if the people knew what she had done. And that history has not really been taught.
And I know you were very responsible for helping her in implementing a national holiday for Dr. King, too.
Yes, myself and thousands of other people. Well, Stevie Wonder was the foremost leader in that movement.
Was he really?
Stevie Wonder is the one that put his whole career and everything behind Mrs. Coretta Scott King. And of course, when he said anything, it was national news. And he led the drive for Mrs. King to securing votes for that national holiday.
Excellent.
Mrs. King, at the time, after her husband's death, was a member of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Ralph Abernathy was the president. Andrew Young and all the other civil rights leaders were all members. And Mrs. King wanted to establish and institutionalize her husband's legacy in that whole civil rights movement, and especially the nonviolent philosophy. It needs to be said, there is a difference between the nonviolent confrontation and the nonviolent philosophy. The nonviolent direct confrontation was a strategy which they used in the South for that civil rights and human rights movement. The nonviolent philosophy is a philosophy that had nothing to do with the confrontation. The confrontation was to overcome your enemy. The nonviolent philosophy is to overcome the enemies within you.
Ah, interesting.
So that before the people of color and working with white people could work together and overcome their petty jealousies, they had to assume the character of the nonviolent philosophy, which was conquering the enemies such as greed, jealousy. Those are the things that even today keep us from working together. So that philosophy has never really been taught. I used to go down to Atlanta, where Mrs. King used to put on the seminars teaching it. And she had an institute. And I had a certificate from that courses she was giving, and Andrew Young and the different civil rights leaders were teaching it. And I have a certificate from graduating from that. Excellent. On the nonviolent philosophy. So when Ralph Abernathy and them in the FCLC did not believe in what she was trying to do with institutionalizing Dr. King's nonviolent philosophy in that civil rights movement, she left the SCLC and she formed the Martin Luther King Jr. Nonprofit tax-exempt organization for social change.
Now, one question, did Ralph Abernathy and Andrew Young, did they embrace Coretta Scott King after the assassination, or was she a little bit, did they kind of have her a little bit on the outside?
It was on the outside as what she saw as Dr. King's legacy and what Ralph Abernathy saw.
Ah, so it wasn't, they weren't on the same page necessarily.
No, they didn't understand the movement the same way, or Dr. King's
interesting
philosophy. So she left and formed that organization, and Andrew Young, Wyatt Walker, Bernard Lafayette, who was lieutenants with Dr. King, went with her. And the others stayed in the SCLC with Ralph Abernathy. When she established the national holiday, then Ralph Abernathy and the others, or even before that, acknowledged that she was right, what she'd done.
Beautiful.
But they were forced to, because you can't argue with success. And so she showed by example. And so they embraced what she was doing. And I don't know whether Dr. King would have been so well remembered today if it was not for Mrs. Coretta Scott King, because now it became a national holiday and it is celebrated throughout the country, throughout the world.
Sure.
Because of that national holiday and the recognition of that. So when you asked me the question when we first talked about why should we remember Dr. King, I would think that was the question that Mrs. King had asked herself.
Interesting.
Why and how can we and why should we? And I think this probably what led her to institutionalize it, doing the thinking and everything else. She has not been recognized or given recognition on a national level that she should be, but I'm sure she will in time. So I think it's important to start at that point and to document history.
Sure.
And to me, history is when you talk about a historian, history is simply documenting the events as they happen. Today, a lot of that history is misrepresented, which is not really history.
And we have talked about that amongst ourselves for a number of years, that history is not, if you're delivering misinformation, then the whole point, message, and legacy of whatever you're studying is going to be twisted.
Yes. This is why they don't understand Dr. King's nonviolent philosophy. Right here in the town of Barstow, I founded the Martin Luther King Jr. Center. At Mrs. King's request, she said, because we were corresponding back and forth between the organizations, so when you sent a letter from here saying the Martin Luther King Center from Cape Cod, and then you get one back to Martin Luther King Center of Atlanta, she said we're being confusing to the people when you're talking about the Martin Luther King Center, which one you're referring to.
Sure.
So she said, change one name. So I changed the center to the Martin Luther King Jr. Society at her request to do that. Now, to understand the nonviolent philosophy, I was never understood by black leaders here in the town of Barstow, nor was I ever understood by the officials of the town of Barstow. The town of Barstow representative wanted to work with the King Center, putting up a Martin Luther King library or museum at the Lombard Farm, where they had a building there. And I probably didn't explain myself that well, but I did not do it. At the time, we had white and black in the King Society working together, which was part of that philosophy and the establishment of the beloved community. Because his philosophy taught it was not enough to do something together, but it's the way that you do it. To get away from the slave and the master mentality.
Right.
What I was trying to do, and I went here throughout the minority community from Wareham to Howard, and got all, for every family I went to except one would pay $10 a month to acquire funds to get a building to put the Martin Luther King's either library or library museum in.
Sure.
Because part of the building of a beloved community is not to put it in a building that is owned by the town, where they're the masters and you there as a slave.
Right.
But together, we're together and by the people. And again, you don't want to get just the people that are well-to-do or more prosperous to come up with the money.
Sure.
Do it in such a way so that the least of these can have equal say, equal right. That's what it's all about, sitting at the table of brotherhood as equals. Now, through your own sweat, you raise the money to get a building, then put his library. Now you've done it according to his philosophy. If you do not do it according to his philosophy, then you are not fulfilling the dream.
Now, when you explain it, it sounds like a no-brainer now. It's just like that's the way it should be. But I can see where you ran into opposition because either town leaders or somebody else would say, well, we'll give you the building. I said, we don't want you to give us the building. We wanted to earn it and
we want the
organize it
people
ourselves.
to own the building.
Right.
Take the museum. Before the town, the museum was a church, the Zion Union Church.
Right.
That Zion Union Church was the last remaining symbol of the black community and the contribution to the town by the black community.
Sure.
The last one. When the town took it over, I didn't want to question how they were able to take it over, and then they gave it to the NACP to put a museum in. It destroyed that legacy of the black community's contribution to the development of the town.
Interesting. Yeah, I can see that when you're
by
describing.
that building and property and everything being owned by the town of Barnstable, and they are now simply put a museum in it, and they say they are doing the history of the African American and Cape Verdean community. Well, there's no sign outside saying African American or Cape Verdean American. And when I question the town, or question Reed or Harold Toby, why isn't it? Well, we don't want to cause any trouble. I said, what trouble? If you are a museum that represents me, why doesn't it say African American Museum or Cape Verdean Museum?
Sure.
It says a museum for the Zion Union Church. Not black, not white, and that's fine. But when you can go through the town of Barnstable and you see churches, stores, everything, Brazilian, Jewish, Greek church, Greek bakery, it doesn't bring up any flags of alarm.
No.
But the minute you say, we're going to put the name African American, oh, we don't want to be prejudiced, we don't want to start racism. Well, racism is when you see a difference between an African American museum and a Greek museum.
That's a very good point.
That's racism.
Yeah, that's...
You should see it as an American.
Yeah, true.
And it is because of that. Now, Mrs. King, and I got to bring this in.
Absolutely. We're getting...
Now, Mrs. King was against Black History Month. She fought to make it a part of American history, taught in the American schools as part of American history. But the government went to the national NACP, got their support, because they were going to turn whole Black History Month over to the NACP. So they supported the Black History Month ideology,
Sure.
rather than it being a part of American history.
Yeah, and as we were talking before the show, there's no way to separate Black history and without being an integral part of American history. What would American history be without Black?
That's right.
There's nothing, you know.
That's right, because you have to go back to the Native Americans.
Right. That's right. Now we're into another thing.
Okay, now, what I was against, and then NACP was all for it, on the bicentennial,
Yeah.
and they were celebrating the history of the town of Barnstable. They held white history over at Dumfries, and the NACP held the Black history over at the Melody Tent.
So they had them in two separate locations?
And they're talking about they're not racist.
Oh,
But look at, you're not only talking about white racism, you're talking about Black racism. Because why is the NACP taking and teaching the Black history over there separate from the history of the town of Barnstable? Now, the Historical Society of the town of Barnstable records that history that was taught at the white meeting of celebrating the celebrating the bicentennial and the history of the town of Barnstable. There is no mention in the Historical Society of the town of Barnstable of any of that history that was held by the NACP over at the Melody Tent.
Really?
And they said, it's because you have Black History Month. You can show it then. Well, that's not the same thing.
No.
Because future generations, hundreds of years from now, will be able to read that history at that Historical Society. They will find no history of that meeting at the Melody Tent. And yet, the NACP and none of these leaders find anything wrong with that.
Interesting.
So, there is a lot of work yet to be done. And it's going backwards rather than forwards, because you do not continue the legacy of that history by continually doing the separate Black History Month.
I agree. I agree with you 100% on that. Now, a question on maybe from a historical context. If Dr. King had not been assassinated, how would his message have continued? Would it have changed? And where do you think we would be now in race relations in the United States?
If Dr. King had lived, because what he was working on was the Poor People's Campaign in Washington. Now, the Poor People's Campaign in Washington
that's right. I forgot about
was an economic agenda. What he would have done was to end poverty and include blacks into the mainstream of economics. If you applied the nonviolent philosophy to economics, and this again is to defeat the enemy within you, blacks as a people would have been much further advanced economically. Why? They would have had a national black bank. There's not a national manufacturing concern on a national level. There's no national newspaper. There is no national anything within the black community. Their Poor People's Campaign and the nonviolent philosophy is how to work together. Now, I attended a seminar in Atlanta that Mrs. King had put on, celebrating one of the anniversaries, where from Detroit, the black banks came and they had started a black bank in Detroit.
Sure.
And they were up and talking, but they were started out $3 million in debt.
They started out $3 million?
Started out. Well, you know the bank's going to fail.
Absolutely.
Now, applying the nonviolent philosophy, and you involved all the people, what you would have done is started a local fund by the people to establish a bank. Now you would have been $3 million in the black. And that's the first time white leaders have used the word black in a positive sense when it comes to counting their money.
Right.
Okay?
Interesting.
Because if you're in any other color, you're in trouble. But if
Right.
you're in the black.
If you're in the red, you're in trouble.
So that was a positive use of the word black. See? So the thing was to kill Dr. King, was to kill the dream, was to kill the nonviolent philosophy. And if it wasn't because of his wife, it would have been successful.
That's an amazing thought that I'm sure many of us don't put together and don't think of how that would have impacted it. And I'd almost forgotten about all the work that he did to end poverty. And how that probably would have been almost a more important stance in the work that he was doing.
This is why he was assassinated.
Well,
They didn't care how much you talked about black and white. When you start talking about dollars.
Yeah, that I'm telling you, I've understood this from you over the years, because a lot of what you talk about is how economy and the economic impact of things direct history, direct government, direct society, and that is very a critical part of what we're doing. And I'd forgotten all about that. Well, it is our time is short on this particular topic, but you've also agreed that we will get together in a few weeks and talk about a little bit more of the impact of Black History Month, which we touched on today, and a little bit more of the economical impact and how it affects society. And so to have you come back, do you mind coming back and talking about this again?
I would love to.
Good. Well, we will continue this dialogue, and we recorded another program with your daughter, Marianne Barboza, and Jimmy Little, who are very articulate in the civil rights struggle. And so, Walter Barboza, thank you very much for joining us. It's great. We hope that people, this whetted your appetite to find a little bit more about what's going on in the human and economic and civil rights struggle in the United States. Join us next time on Profile. My name's Terry Duenas. We'll see you then.